Okay, we've now started recording, and this recording we'll post it in our YouTube channel shortly after this meeting. Speaking of social media, if you're interested in keeping in touch, you can find us on YouTube, as I just mentioned, as well as LinkedIn and Twitter if you search for KWSQA. And so I'd like to welcome you all to our March 2022 virtual quality talk. Couple of thank yous to kick things off. As always, I would like to thank the members of the KWSQA board for their ongoing efforts into helping maintain this great community that we have, and also to D2L for continuing to let us use their Zoom account for these virtual meetings. And on the topic of appreciation and acknowledgements, I just also want to call out that we continue to appreciate the privilege of being able to live and work and build our software quality community here in this region. Specifically, our head office is located on the Haldeman Tract, which is land that was promised to the Haudenosaunee people of the Six Nations of the Grand River. And it's also within the traditional territory of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples. Doing a little spotlight on our website today here. So here are all the things that you can do when you visit kwsqa.org. You can submit proposals for things like a quality talk, such as the one you're currently attending. You can also submit a proposal for our upcoming conference that we're really hoping can happen this fall after a 2-year break. Or you can submit a proposal for a testing games event. We haven't had too many of those either lately, but we are prepared to host them either virtually or maybe sometime in nicer weather and an outdoor setting. Or yeah, we're open to what works for people. So let us know if your company would like to potentially host one of those events, or if you just would like more information about what that is. Other things you can do, you can purchase a membership. So this year, again, these cost $20 Canadian. And although you don't require a membership to come to these virtual events, if you do purchase one, it just helps give us a little bit of financial support. And if you are in sort of our general geographic region, then it will enable you to vote in our election, which takes place at the end of this calendar year. Finally, you can also sign up for our mailing list from our website. So if social media is not as much your thing, then we do send out more traditional email style communications as well. All right. Yeah, I did mention our conference, which is called Targeting Quality, hopefully coming up this fall. It's tentatively planned for the 26th and 27th of September at the same location that we used for the last few years, the Cambridge Hotel and Conference Center. And we do have our CFP open now for both 1 hour, I think, presentations, traditional length presentations, I guess, as well as the lightning talks, which are shorter, only 15 minutes. Or if you'd like to propose an idea for a full day workshop, you can do that as well. Speaking of upcoming events, next month's Quality Talk, we're going to welcome Neil Price-Jones as our speaker. He has been a fantastic supporter of our organization over the years, and haven't heard him do a presentation in a little while, so we are looking forward to that for next month. Switching focus to today's event, just a reminder that our code of conduct is applicable for both virtual and in-person events. And please do let us know if you have any questions at all about this or need to report any kind of incident. We will be here to answer your email. Just reach out at info@kwsqa.org. And once the meeting's done, you will receive an email that contains a link where you can fill out a feedback survey. We really love to hear your feedback. It helps both our organization and our speakers understand what went well and what we could try doing differently in the future. So to help motivate you to take a few minutes to do this, we're offering you a chance to win a $50 Amazon gift card during a draw that will take place at our AGM meeting later this year. Okay, those are all my things that I wanted to say. So we'll get to the good part now. We'd like to welcome Katie Foxx to this meeting. She'll be presenting some of her viewpoints on unit tests from the perspective of a tester. So without any further ado, I will pass it over to you, Katie.
Awesome, thank you, Tina. Figure out how to click a share screen again because it's very easy to forget that. Or on my computer to just not respond. Cool, so that should be loaded. Thank you all for having me here today. I am relatively new to the presenting world, and I have found that each time I get to talk about it, I get to learn how to communicate a little better, especially when it comes to PowerPoint and presentation. So I echo the request for feedback at the end. That would help me greatly. This talk I have fondly renamed to Unit Tests Are for Testers Too, because that made a fun newsletter title, where the Tester's Appreciation for Unit Tests was a good conference title, and I don't know, tell me if you have a better name. So I'm Katie Foxx. I'm a senior software QA engineer and team lead at eBuilder, which is a Trimble company. And I like to start off by telling a little about myself so I become a little bit more of a person and less of a just person talking. This is me and my cat and my partner and my new puppy. I grew up in Florida, so I live in the States. I grew up in Florida. That's where I went to school, went to university, got my first job. I relocated to Washington, the Seattle area, for a different change of pace, somewhere else to live. I worked remotely during that time, so I got a little head start on the pandemic, but not a ton. Discovered trail and ultra running, which I love and especially miss in the mountains there. And I last year moved to Atlanta, Georgia. New house, new mortgage, new puppy is the progression I've titled there. From the professional side, as I said, I work at eBuilder, which is a Trimble company now. And previously, I worked at Ultimate Software, which is now merged and become UKG. Everything that I learned about testing pretty much came from initial training and experience at Ultimate Software. So a huge thanks to all my mentors that were involved during that time. I had the honor of presenting at the 2021 Pacific Northwest Software Quality Conference. That is the most of what I'm covering in this presentation came from that initial paper and presentation. And my testing interests, they're broad, but I would say the most recent ones and the ones I care most about and have developed some skill in is focusing on automation reliability, reducing the need for UI tests, and minimizing redundancy between different layers of test automation. So between your unit, integration, UI tests, etc. So that's just a little my background. So unit tests are test developers, right? This cheesy title came from a process in which I was interviewing other tester candidates, and we would ask about the test pyramid and ask these candidates to describe unit and integration tests to us. And this quote was the most common response that we got for unit tests. And my interview partner and I thought we could get better answers from that, but once we heard it so many times, I started questioning, like, why do I think differently, and how would I encourage other people to see the potential in unit tests? How could they be used in regular testing work, not just, oh, you have background as a developer and you know how to write unit tests, and so, if you're already familiar with them, this is not about how to do them tons better. This talk is specifically for, as a tester in a traditional, like both manual and automating sense, how can we leverage our unit tests, whether we have familiarity with them or not. And so there's or do they hold value for testers too? I would argue that by reviewing and improving them, we improve our risk-based testing outcomes. And that typically our test automation, especially through the UI, is very strong at catching potential regression issues. It gives us good confidence that we haven't regressed. But if you want to tweak a UI test, in order to do some exploratory testing, there's usually going to be a lot of overhead and it's going to be very tedious. And so similarly, you could test manually. But an idea I would pose here is we could use some unit tests in order to test aspects of code changes in an exploratory manner to see how does the code behave. So some context, we're assuming the existence of unit tests for this. This is not a talk on how you go and decompose your code to make it testable to write unit tests. This is assuming they already exist using dependency injection. I'm not assuming developer level code fluency. And at the end, I'll talk more about, okay, these concepts that I'm presenting, how could we maybe translate them to someone who's only familiar with manual testing and not reading code or modifying it themselves. The examples I put together are coming from my background, which was with C# and using the NUnit testing framework, fluent assertions, and fake it easy for dependency fakes. So just so if you have familiarity with that or not, here's where we're coming from. So this is the bulk of my talk, which is 3 ways that I would suggest we can use unit tests to improve our traditional testing experience, like reducing risk, asking questions about where that risk might lie, and testing hypotheses around what code changes might introduce risk. And so the first one is that unit tests can provide us with example inputs and outputs for a method, a unit of behavior implemented by code. So captured in the unit test, you would see the setup or the arrange, and then you would see the assertions, which would be the output. And these will be at a very granular level, but they, for me, like taught me how to think about these smaller steps in the code. Number 2 is that the unit tests, unit tests help clearly identify the different integration points and dependency behavior assumptions, because you will see that mocked or faked as you are setting up your test class. So even if you don't understand what each class does, how each piece of code works together, it does at least define, hey, these are dependencies within this part of the code base. And then the third is that there is granular control to test exploratory hypotheses at the method level. So we'll walk through an example, but if you see, or if seeing one test with, as in point 1, like you get the example of input and output, and that causes me to think, well, how would it behave with like this input, or would that produce the same output? With a unit test, I have the ability to either create another one or modify that test in order to find out in real time what the answer is there, rather than going through the effort to set up a manual exploratory session to test the same thing. So moving on to example 1 for inputs and outputs. This is a pretty simple example, but it is coming from a real bug that I found with one of my teams before around rounding. We worked within a financial space for calculating taxes that were due, or any other, apply a rate, get a number result, how do we round it, when do we round it, and so forth. And so for example, inputs and outputs, here we see in the arrange section, we're setting up a tax rate, and we're setting up some amount before tax that we are going to pass in to our method that's under test. Within the act, we then see, okay, we pass in those 2 variables to this method, total with tax. This is the method we're testing. We're grabbing the result, and then we're asserting that the result should be this number. So in the realm of input and output, like, okay, I can see when we're calculating this total with tax and we are verifying the rounding on it. Cool. We have our input, we have our rate, we have our output. And I can go check that on the side, and I can say, all right, when I plug an 8.5% tax to $17, I'm actually going to type this on the side because when I get nervous, I don't remember the numbers anymore. But we get, I believe it's 18.445. I can't type, but that's cool. There we go, 18.445. And so this example is testing Banker's rounding, which, if you're familiar with traditional rounding that you probably learned somewhere in grade school, then let's say you have the number 18.5. If you were rounding that to just a whole number, you would get 19. Or you have 18.45, you're rounding it to a single decimal place, you would get 18.5. Banker's rounding works by always, if you have an equal likelihood of getting that half remainder, it alternates rounding up and rounding down. So I think it's called like a, it's not round up or round down, maybe it's like round even. Actually, I think it is round even, because the result is that so there's the 18.445, there's an invisible 5 at the end that's being rounded. And so it always rounds it in the direction of the even number before the 5. And so in this case, since we had 445, it rounds it down to the 4. If this were 455, it would round it up to the 6. All of that to set up the next couple examples, because we'll use Banker's rounding for the next few as well. I am going to move on, and we will come back to this if we need to or have more questions. Part 2 was that we can use unit tests to identify the integration points or the dependency behaviors, or help question those dependency behaviors. And I think this is one of my favorite things, because I have experienced a lot of bugs that come out of a misassumption about whether some service or repository, like, does it return a null list or an empty list? Like, do we need to check for one or the other? What did we write our test against? Hopefully I'm not the only one that's just suffered that. Not that I'm wishing the pain on anyone else, but it exists, and it's caused bugs in real time on our teams. So the first part here is, we can ask the question when we're looking at this test, what integration points exist? And then the second is, what assumptions might exist because of how the test was set up? Like, we don't know for sure, but let's ask the question. Like, let's have that conversation. So looking through this example, we see kind of similar setup. This is amount before tax, $17. And this time we have a different second parameter. This is location, just named it city name. And then we see this setting up a fake response for mock rate service. So just looking through this, it looks like we're setting up so that when we call the mock rate service, we call the method get sales tax rate, and we pass in the location we specify, it's going to return this rate. So it should be recognizable at 8.5% from example 1. So it's going to be doing a pretty similar thing, and we can see here we're asserting the same result, but this time we're introducing we can see we're testing a different method, and that method might be calling this dependency. All of this is still assuming we're just looking at the test. We're not necessarily digging into the code yet, but what could this test tell us about the code that is underlying it? And then what might we want to consider testing in addition? So when I see this, I'm like, all right, cool. It returns the 8.5%. If this test passes, then I'm pretty sure that, if we call with the right city name, it returns. This is not testing, okay, is it returning the right rate for this location? That is not this mock rate service. This is not what's under test. What's under test is when we're passing in the city and, asserting against the rate that we've mocked. So we've mocked the service to return the 8.5% when it returns that and it applies it to the $17, we still get that same result of 1844. So next is so that tells us that that's an integration point we have, the mock rate service. Like, because we are faking this, we don't know for sure, okay, how does it handle if a location doesn't exist? Or could there be bad data somewhere that when we call for this location, it could return a null or it could return a negative number? Those are all questions that come to my mind when I see this dependency, because we are only mocking it in a happy path manner. But when we're doing some integration testing, we would want to consider, how could this go wrong, right? And hopefully the developer is considering that too, but sometimes you get into a lot of copying and pasting with tests, and this might be stuff that still you would think of manually, but I look at this and say, unit tests point me to understand this faster. Like, there is this risk that exists in the form of how we are interacting with another service dependency. And so it's not, the test isn't telling me the answers of, yeah, we have this risk, or we've handled it, or we have bugs, but it starts the conversation there. And for point 3, unit tests can provide us some granular control for testing exploratory hypotheses. And so this example will look pretty similar to the first one. And the questions here is, we can ask, what additional scenarios do we want to test? Like, if we've reviewed our unit tests, does it bring to mind additional scenarios that we would test? And can we use some existing automation and just add additional cases? Are there tests missing maybe that we would want to write? And so here, in our previous example 1, which I'll go back and slide, we'll see it's just testing a single amount and a single tax rate. And as I talked through it, I said, okay, well, I know from running this through on my calculator that when you multiply these two, or when you add this tax to $17, then you get 18.445. And so this is specifically testing the round down case. But if it's bankers rounding, like, we want to make sure it applies for both rounding down and rounding up, that it's not misimplemented in the back. And so that's where in this point 3, I have 3 test cases that I've just kind of expanded based on asking those questions. So the first case up here for 15, this is showing the round up example, because if you added an 8.5% to 15, you would get 16.275. And so if this test passed for this test case, then we know that it is correctly rounding up. Down below here is 17, so this is showing that it's still correctly rounding down to 18.44. And then this test case came out, or this was another one to show just standard rounding. Here, the result would be 17.6855. So it's not, the 5 isn't the last digit after the precision point that we're rounding to. So in this case, some standard rounding would come into play, and you would get 0.69 rather than if it were just 0.685, it would round down to 0.68. So still pretty simple. There's probably still more test cases we could think to add for that, but starting point of how can we take a test that we already saw and then add, based on what we know, or assuming we know that, okay, this code, we're expecting it to use bankers rounding, let's make sure we've at least covered some different equivalence classes there. Trying to think if there's more examples I would pull out of there, but I won't think about it too hard, and I'll let everyone listening think of more questions, and we'll go from there. So, like I mentioned before, the goal, what I feel passionately about is not only giving a solution that works if you know how to code really well and you know all these different unit testing strategies. Because I think there's value to be had in them from just starting to look at them, even if you don't know what's going on, and talking with a developer about them or just asking questions. Like, you're not going to know it. If you don't already code and write unit tests, you're not just going to immediately get it. But I think some exposure to that will build over time. And if you know how to structure the conversations, like take these 3 tips, structure those conversations with your developer, and how can we expand what we have and make it readable, make it clean, add more to it. So given that, obviously one strategy is that you've had the skills, you conduct some individual exploration and testing, and you use these unit tests and you're comfortable navigating around in them, you can read them, it all makes sense. That's fantastic. I would say that's where I'm at now. I would not say that's where I was at when I started. Step 2 here, or strategy 2 we'll go with, is to do a joint code walkthrough with the developer and a more technical tester, but not necessarily one that knows the code base really well, understands how all the unit tests work. So you're familiarizing with it, but a developer is more walking you through it. So kind of like a code review for the tests where it's interactive, can ask questions, definitely ask questions. Like, the more you ask a developer to explain things, the better they will get to understand it as well. And then third would just be a collaborative discussion between a developer and maybe a more manual focused tester, like where you're not necessarily looking at the code, but you're still taking these conversation points. The input and output, developer would be able to provide that, or like what input and output combinations are covered in unit tests, what dependencies exist, like what pieces of code or where could different things break down, like how many pieces have to work together. Does the data have to be good? Are we validating that? Can there be read and write issues going back and forth? And then if you have already thought of test cases prior to that conversation, proactively asking, like, okay, what about this? Can we expand more there? What this type of test case that I've envisioned, can we put it into a unit test? So this is where I started, all the way down here, because I did not know how to write unit tests when I started my job. Thankfully, had very patient developers who started those well. And this middle point for the joint code walkthrough, that's what we did on multiple of my teams as part of moving a story like from development to QA. We would start having these test walkthrough conversations. And they worked really well, and it helped. So starting from having no knowledge and just discussing more of the risks to, okay, let's look at where those risks are in the code, to, okay, I feel comfortable enough with this, I'm going to start looking at it on my own. That progression happened over time. That's where most of this talk is coming through, because that's a knowledge and skill set that I really value, and I think helps me look at what other types of test automation do I need to write. Okay, this is the reach me at slide, which I'll leave up for a second, but I would love to make this much more conversational now, because I learned from previous presentations, like, what I'm presenting is only specific to my teams that I've worked on, but I'd love to hear more from you about what questions or different scenarios you have in which this may or may not apply. So Tina, I don't know if you need to do anything specific to open that up, or if I should keep screen sharing. I'll let you chime in.
I think that everyone should be able to unmute themselves, and also you should be able to type in the chat if you prefer that. So feel free to go ahead in either method if you have questions, comments, thoughts, everybody.
I'm gonna kill the share for now because I like
sure. then we
faces
can
the other
see
people
more
better. Yeah.
people. And feel free to turn on your video if you're not eating your lunch and feel want to show your face.
Yeah.
One thing that came to mind for me was back at the beginning when you said how like every person you were interviewing always answered the question the same way, like, oh, those are the tests that the developers write. Like, where do you think that comes from? Like, what are the things that happen in companies and teams today that drive that perception?
How, yeah, I'm going to try to figure out how to answer this concisely. But in short, I was looking a lot into like the test pyramid and shift left testing, which are both big topics and buzzwords, and generally everyone is on board with, but might have slightly different opinions about what that looks like. And my thought is that we tried to, culturally, development teams tried to, in the test pyramid, push more tests down to unit tests. Like, well, we need to have that. We need more rapid feedback around the changes that we've made and confidence that, we didn't break or regress hugely in our code changes. So like pushing down on unit tests is good, and they require a lot of code familiarity. So the developer is going to do them. But then also on the shift left side, it's like, okay, how can we have our tests earlier? Like they kind of go together, the pyramid and the shifting left. Like how can we get more unit tests earlier so we get that feedback cycle? But then I think, and it might be how teams were structured differently, if like development and testing were like different teams or completely siloed workflows. So I found that the environment in which all this works well is we have cross-functional teams for development that include our business analysts, our developer, our tester, and we're involving testers in the conversation from the point at which we are like reviewing the requirements for a story that a developer is going to pick up, so that the tester can be thinking of their test cases, so that the developer can be writing the automation, but also when they're done, you can have that conversation in a pretty informed manner.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense that maybe people have been in environments where like the test team and the dev team are, first of all, separate, and second of all, maybe trying to draw like clear boundaries of responsibility. Like, oh, okay, your part of the pyramid is that, and we'll take this other stuff. And
Yeah, because another thing I've both seen in reading or in my own experience or heard in other people talking about this is like this desire or ideal that like your tester is pretty equally technical with your developer, right? And so it'd be nice if there was just all this overlap between skill sets and anyone can do anything, but then you still have your tester that's like fully focused on everything usability as well. And so there's a lot of like, that's what we need to get to, but not as much like, how do we get there? Or does that work for every team? In some of my teams, we've still been very like UI heavy, which is user error heavy, think like a user heavy, and you can't just go dig into the world of code and like forget about all the ways in which your assumptions about how the code works and the ways in which the user could interact with the web app could be very different, and all the explosions could happen. So much of what, when I heard those interview questions, like, okay, well, how did I get from being at that point as well, where I was said, like, yeah, the developers write the unit tests. I don't know. They exist, right? I know they need to be there. And the developer has the skills that are most well suited to writing them. But then it comes over to the wall to me, and I never have enough time to do anything. So they're there, check mark, move on. And so what I was really digging into was, how did I find them useful? Like, how did they become not just a check mark, but ways in which I could find out, like, okay, this is my favorite example is like a UI test around, okay, when you select or when you have a record with this status on the screen, it should have these action items available to it in a drop-down list. It's like, okay, well, I could set this record in transit, and then I can check the list and see that it has a cancel option or see that it has a complete option. And then I can complete it, and then I can see that it has like these options remaining, like go through all the state changes, like a full state diagram for this record in a UI test, or I can have unit tests that tell me all the combinations. And then in a UI test, I'm just verifying like a single path through and that it's all kind of hooked up. But the pieces of logic and all their permutations are tested in a unit test individually. And you're not doing like combinatorial testing in the UI,
Yeah.
which is
I
what
think
we had sometimes.
I think
So
that can be tempting for sure. And we have a comment in the chat from Mark kind of to that effect, where if you are aware of the coverage of the unit test, then maybe it means that you can, as you were just describing, like skip a whole pile of permutations in terms of your either manual testing or automated UI level testing, because both of those things are super expensive to do and to maintain. So
it is. One of my coworkers who had a both different experience and a different love for type of testing than I did. She loved her UI tests and she loved like doing them well. She was excellent at that. But in code reviews, so what we kind of ran into was like, okay, we have different testers with different skill sets involved in code reviews, but they kind of look at different things like, how can we kind of create a minimum standard here? And so one of them was, oh, you see a new code file introduced. Is there a corresponding test file being introduced for it? Like, are you introducing unit tests? Which, Mark, it sounds like that's a lot of what you're calling out there, and make sure you're not at least creating new gaps. It might not help you find what's existing, but if that's what your company or team has set as a standard, is like, well, we're going to build our unit test coverage, then that's the perfect way to start, is just having conversations with the developer when it seems like it's forgotten or missed. Sometimes they come back and they say like, oh, well, it's really hard to test that. Like, it didn't seem worth it. And then you can have the conversation of, oh, really? Can we do it better? Are we sure? So it helps. I think I've found that it just helps to have a lot more quality conversations in the development phase, because your developers may be perfectly capable of thinking of all that themselves. That doesn't mean they do every single time. Like, a person who's focused on thinking about that, saying like, nope, we really need to have those unit tests. Even just someone else reading them, I found out like if the test is kind of confusing to read, the developer might be able to write it better. That should be a code smell to me. But yeah, what else? Other questions, please.
I've got one.
Maybe.
Oh.
Go ahead. Go ahead. You go ahead, Rob.
I related to that. So you brought up at the beginning of the presentation around moving to the left, right? And also the inclusion of the unit testing and stuff. From a perspective of all the different types of QA work that you can do, combining those two, because I find moving further to the left involves a lot more conversations with product management and development and stuff. So from that perspective, time-wise, where do you find that you spend yourself spending time for the different activities, or are you more focused in the work that you do?
You're talking, so tell me, understand that question, is that between like the planning and the discussion part versus the actual testing it part that you're asking?
So I guess it would be like planning, getting things ready, possible manual testing, automation, development, whatever else. Where do you find, like, I'm not aware of your role entirely as far as what is the scope of what you do, because traditionally here in KW, a lot of the companies have seen, they either have one or the other, like you brought up, right? Like you either have the strategists / or the developers, or you have the combined, which are kind of more rare. But with moving to the left, I find that the engagements are earlier and better.
Yeah.
But the result is too that there's a lot of time spent in conversations and getting things right, so we can have things ready properly for the developers to actually build up the stories to cut our work down the road, right?
Yeah. So what I found was that in my, let's say in my ideal world and my favorite like team structure that we had, there was just this expectation that before a story was worked on, there was a conversation to kick it up. We called it a kickoff between the developer, the business analyst, and a tester. And so that was that was kind of the, do we think that the requirements contain everything they need to so that we can get this as close as possible to correct the first time? Then after the development, so any clarification, figure that out. Also, preemptively thinking of, okay, what are our like edge cases or testing risks that we can anticipate at this time? Like, let's get those answered ahead of time before we even code this story. Like, we know we need to consider how this is going to interact or these types of results. And then after the developers coded the story, we would have what we called a dash check, which started out as just, okay, are the acceptance criteria met before this story goes into testing? Because we would sometimes have that, like, this is a requirement and it's like very clearly not met. So we wanted to catch those. But as we got good at those, then it started becoming this preliminary testing. Like any questions that we have, any quick scenarios we can think of that we can execute right now, we're going to do that. It gets the developer into the mindset of figuring out those tests. It helps save the tester time. So by the time they're actually getting the story to test, you've knocked out the acceptance criteria, you've knocked out your top like risk considerations, like your really basic, like, oh, this would need rework if this wasn't met. And now you can really get into some interesting bugs, some edge cases, some complicated setups, some services going down or other sorts of performance testing issues. So that was kind of the progression of like, part of it feels like pushing more on the developer, but it's also really like, it's getting everything done faster. It's getting the story done faster. And so I don't know. I don't feel quite satisfied with that answer, but that's where it came at.
So out of the percentage of your days, how much of it is invested into the unit testing and percentage wise, roughly, versus other activities? I think that maybe.
Sure. Probably.
Sorry, I'm just going to jump in here as well, because that was exactly my question.
Okay.
As Rob asked, because I was wondering, like, given that QA teams have limited time and budget, how would you split the time between unit testing, system testing, manual testing?
Sure.
How much weight would you give unit testing?
I would say the point that I was getting to was probably in the realm of like 1/3 to 2/3 or like half and half. But the goal was that all of that unit testing review and those conversations were reducing or eliminating work that I would need to do with the manual testing. So it's all like, oh, this is already covered. It's substituting for. So I don't think that number is going to be the same for everyone, but that was why I was emphasizing it heavily, especially in my own work, was I found it allowed me to reduce the TDM of manual testing to have these conversations, and up to the point of like, I'm spending about 1/3 of my day on it, but it's still getting things done faster than it would otherwise.
Well, I guess, and from a regression standpoint later, if there was still some manual left over, right, that was still required to do manually, I guess, the scope of that would be significantly reduced.
Right. And it,
good.
And it's only going to be as good as you're actually finding the gaps and supplementing the automation, so you don't have to keep considering it like manually for regression over and over again. It's you're building up your own knowledge as well as your whole team's knowledge of what do we have in our test automation by continually reevaluating it. Because it's really easy to write unit tests that you then never look at again and forget that you have coverage in that area, and you go and you write like a whole UI test that covers the same thing. Yeah. And so that personally is what I cannot stand.
Yeah.
And so the being in it repeatedly and taking every story as an opportunity to refresh that is what I care about.
So just to make sure I got it right, you said 1/3 to 1/2 of time is spent on unit tests and the other is spent on system tests, because there's other automation testing, right? That's not unit testing. And then there's manual testing.
Right. So how I was answering it was 1/3 to 1/2 of the time is either in this unit test review or the conversations around that shift left approach to testing, where you're either like helping the developers set up scenarios earlier, or you're having these kickoffs for stories. So 1/3 of my day is involved in not the actual testing of my story, but it is offloading work that I would have to do testing my story to an earlier part in the process. Or it either offloading, or in the sense of reviewing unit tests, I'm convincing myself that things I might need to manually test or might need to write more complicated UI tests for have already been tested at the unit level, and so I don't need it the same way.
And what code coverage do you aim for? What percentage?
Different depending on different teams, but I believe 85 to 90 is where we've been at. Currently working on a newer service, and so catching up on some of that. But with established teams, it was, I don't know if we were ever enforcing it, but 90 for our standard REST API services repositories was what we were going for. That doesn't involve any like startup code or user context stuff, but just for the core business rules and processes. Awesome questions. What else?
Good stuff. What else do you guys want to know? People feeling excited to maybe try some of this? It sounded like the previous two questions were possibly getting at the idea that maybe you'd have to try and make a good case to your leadership about why it makes sense to divert a bunch of testers' attention to this.
Yeah.
I don't think in my case there really is a lot of convincing. We've already been working through the benefits of moving more left. That's one thing I've been pushing for, because when you get caught in later after the coding and the development criteria has already been developed, and you're finding holes, then it's already too late. It's expensive at that point, right? And it's frustrating because it also slows testing efforts down, right? So puts you further behind. So if you get in before anything starts, it typically works out a lot better by the time it gets to the testing part. But yes, involvement of automation, again, optimizing where do you need to spend your time. If that stuff's already covered and these things are already known and they're already tested for, then we can reduce what we have to do, which is significant actually. Because if you don't have large teams to begin with, how do you optimize your time, right? And that's kind of one of the considerations. So
yeah, I would echo that. In thinking about this more, figuring out how to communicate it, the key part I realized, and in looking up, okay, what is shift left? Where did that originate? What was intended? It is not what I learned about at my job, thinking of it, which is like, oh, shift your tests left, have more unit tests, write them earlier, whatever. It really was involving the tester in the conversation earlier. And I would say, like, even if you're not involving unit tests at all, like that is the starting point, having that conversation be more seamless. And then unit tests can just be a medium for those conversations, or a way of structuring, like, here's how we know we have coverage here. Or I would also say going into these conversations, already having thought about what, like, especially looking at the unit tests, I would emphasize you already have some test cases in mind and you're really just looking to see, are they here? And if not, okay, where would we add them? You're not necessarily looking to be convinced by the unit tests that they're fine without having already done your own thinking about it, like full test scenario ideation before then. But then, like, okay, can I offload my work and say, hey, check this unit test covered?
that's an interesting conversation I haven't had yet.
Which conversation?
The offloading part is this would be best served by unit or integration testing versus system level or manual, right? And that would allow us to reduce the scope of the other ones. That is, yeah, I like that.
Yeah, it's like once you start thinking about that way, I guess you have to like not get overly enthusiastic and just like, oh, we're not going to write any UI tests anymore.
No.
But that's where I get, and that's where this whole talk came from. It's like, I feel very passionately that unit tests, and then they kind of really lead well into integration tests. And when you have both of those and they're solid, you can get away from having as many UI tests, which I feel like is a dream for many people because they cause headaches everywhere. So kind of applying a logical reasoning to what tests can I get rid of because I know how this code is structured and what is covered in a different type of test at the unit or integration level. So I like, as I was thinking about it, many thoughts came from integration tests, but you can boil them down to more simple things to look for, conversations to have with the unit tests, especially when it comes to the dependencies and how you fake or mock them. Like, oh, we think we can just do this. Like, oh, does it return an empty list? Does it return, results that you your code would not be happy with. So that's a gotcha, but it's fun ones. I like how it lets you think about the testing problem rather than just let's layer some more system and UI tests on top. That's what we have.
More is not always better.
Yeah. Also,
Okay,
unit
Ed.
tests can usually be reliable. They can be unreliable, but more often than not, they run very quickly and do not flake out and fail for unexpected reasons.
Anyone else want to get in with other discussion topics here in the last couple minutes? Definitely had lots of great ideas to think through. So thank you so much, Katie. If no one is, if we're out of questions, then we could give a few minutes back where you could potentially go fill out the feedback survey.
Oh, good reminder. Please do. If something wasn't clear or could have, even if it's like, oh, this type of example could have made it a lot more clear, I'd love to hear that, please, and thank you.
Cool. Sounds like your banker's rounding example did resonate well with some of the audience. So yeah.
It's where I found a bug because we made an assumption about how things should be rounded, and apparently there are many different ways, especially within the financial space. So awesome.
Yeah, well, we really appreciate you sharing this with us, Katie. This is another one of the benefits of having moved these events to a virtual format, is that we can hear from someone like you who doesn't actually live that close to where most of our members are, but it's, you know, relatively easy for us to arrange for you to present, and not as big of a time commitment for you to have to fly to where we are. So we've been loving the just like diversity of people from all over the world actually who have been able to present at this series in the last couple of years. So we really appreciate having you here. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you all. I appreciate it so much. My info is up. If you missed it, Tina or Rob can point you to my email and LinkedIn, and I would love to hear more.
Good. Have a great rest of the day, everybody. Hope to see you next time.
Thank you all.
Cheers.